The war in Ukraine could be entering a game-changing new phase, one that might pull NATO directly into the fight. After over 1,000 days of brutal conflict, both Ukraine and Russia are ramping up their offensives. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian territory with newly approved long-range missiles, while Russia is desperately trying to push deeper into Donbass. But the real shocker, NATO might not stay on the sidelines for much longer. A recent report reveals that France and the UK have reignited talks about deploying troops to Ukraine. These aren't just symbolic discussions, they're about turning the tide of war and ending it once and for all. But what exactly are these talks about? How far are France and the UK willing to go? And could this be the beginning of NATO's next major step in Ukraine? Let's break it down. The Le Monde report doesn't reveal much detail, but it emphasizes growing defense cooperation between France and the UK, with Ukraine at the center of the conversation. While there's no direct mention of NATO troops on the ground, the talks suggest that both countries recognize the need for a stronger, united response to the conflict. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot recently fueled speculation by calling on NATO allies to stop creating red lines. These lines were supposed to define the boundaries of acceptable actions during the war: no direct interventions, certain weapons off-limit, specific zones out of bounds. But over time, these red lines have lost their meaning. As the war drags on, both NATO and Russia have tested, bent, or outright ignored these so-called limits. What started as clear boundaries are now little more than political gestures, leaving the conflict without any real rules. And that's the question. With these lines disappearing, what happens next? Let's dive into how NATO's shifting stance could change the war's future. NATO's red lines were initially meant to contain Russia's aggression and prevent the conflict from spilling beyond Ukraine. The first was simple: stop Russia from invading Ukraine in the first place, with promises of economic sanctions as a deterrent. But when that failed in February 2022, sanctions became a reactive measure rather than a preventative one. Other red lines focused on preventing attacks on civilians and keeping the war's impact localized. But these too were broken as Russia's military ignored boundaries and targeted civilian areas. Calls for war crime investigations and arrest warrants followed, but immediate results remained elusive. Russia, meanwhile, has drawn its own red lines, dozens of them. Most of Putin's lines aim to limit NATO's involvement in the war, from prohibiting Western military aid to opposing donations of tanks, fighter jets, and long-range missiles. Time and again, Putin has threatened consequences, often invoking Russia's nuclear deterrence policy to bolster his warnings. But most of these lines have been ignored or carefully sidestepped by NATO. For example, when Russia objected to the US sending ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, NATO delayed the shipment, opting instead for UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles. With a slightly shorter range of 160 miles, these missiles technically stayed under Russia's stated limit, at least for a time. Ukraine used Storm Shadows to strike Russian supply lines in Donbass and Crimea, forcing Russia to pull equipment back further out of range. This retreat ultimately led to NATO providing ATACMS anyway, escalating Ukraine's long-range capabilities even further. But the real way NATO has countered Russia's red lines? By simply calling Putin's bluff. Again and again, NATO has bet that Russia's threats wouldn't match its actions, and it's largely been right. But why has this gamble paid off? NATO had two good reasons for taking the risk. For one, Russia has effectively started the war by breaking one of the first red lines created between the two entities, and has repeatedly tried to threaten Ukraine further by announcing more and more constricting red lines of its own. In fact, the aggression Russia has been displaying against Ukraine started long before 2022 and, in fact, all the way back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. When the conflict escalated into a full-blown invasion, NATO believed, and perhaps rightly so, that Russia was going to play the part of the aggressor no matter how many red lines the organization broke. Secondly, Russia's red lines were pretty much always followed by vague comments suggesting NATO's actions would be considered geopolitical and strategic violations, prompting Russia to retaliate with nuclear weapons. However, as the first red lines were broken and Russia failed to mount responses directly against NATO, the alliance began to suspect that the threats were idle. One of the few ways that Russia could affect the EU economy was by disconnecting Central Europe from the Russian natural gas supply. However, the US and Norway stepped in to become major exporters to countries throughout Europe, effectively making NATO resource independent from Russia. Even more importantly, Russia's nuclear saber-rattling started getting less frightening with each new threat, particularly considering that NATO had already forced Russia to focus its economy and military on Ukraine rather than NATO. Additionally, the US, France, and the UK all maintain extensive nuclear deterrent strategies and launch discovery mechanisms. If Russia decided to use nuclear weapons against NATO, it would likely need to expend most, if not all, of its nuclear arsenal in one go to attempt to mount a devastating first strike against all three nations. The strategy apparently didn't appeal to Russia, considering that the US was sufficiently far away to mount a counterstrike of its own in time, one which would have a much more devastating effect on the Russian Federation comparatively. As a result, the discussion between the UK and France about directly assisting Ukraine, and their suggestion that NATO stop acknowledging red lines that Russia draws, as well as acting on an axis entirely separate from making red lines of their own, is evocative of a much deeper issue. NATO no longer has much of a reason to believe Putin's threats about what he might or might not do regarding NATO's ongoing assistance in Ukraine. To that end, Barrot hinted that both the UK and France are open about asking NATO to invite Ukraine into the alliance. This would give Ukraine the umbrella of defense that all other members enjoy due to Article 5, which states that members are obligated to provide direct military support to defend each other's territory. The possibility of Ukraine becoming a NATO member was a key part of what started the conflict in the first place. Russia considered NATO expansion a threat to its security, and invading Ukraine presented a multi-pronged solution to Russia's ongoing diplomatic, economic, and demographic problems. And with Ukraine beginning to align itself more and more with the West over the previous 2 decades and in the process shedding its connection with Russia as a former Soviet state, Putin used the threat of NATO membership as one of his justifications to invade. While Ukraine joining NATO would represent the accomplishment of one of the main goals of the current Ukrainian government, and has been for some time now, there are a few issues in that plan. First, NATO has a somewhat confusing and vague set of requirements when it comes to actually determining whether a country can join the alliance. One of the most frequently cited requirements is the country must enact economic and national defense reforms to bring itself in line with the rest of the alliance. However, the country also needs to resolve any outstanding political and territorial issues. The ongoing war in Ukraine would certainly be considered a non-starter with the second condition, since a part of Ukraine's territory is technically occupied and administered by Russia at the moment. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has noted that he'd be open to Ukraine becoming a NATO member, with the territory currently administered by the Ukrainian government immediately falling under NATO's protection. However, the occupied part of Ukraine would be under Russian administration until a more diplomatic solution could be implemented. Still, Zelensky is adamant about Ukraine joining NATO only if they recognize the previous Ukrainian borders, i.e. the ones that predate the 2022 invasion. That puts NATO in a difficult spot. Allowing Ukraine to join NATO while it's still in the middle of an active war could invoke Article 5 and call on its other members to respond. It would plunge most of Europe, the US, and Canada into a direct war with Russia, which could escalate quickly if Russian allies like China and Iran join its side. But if Ukraine does manage to sign an armistice and become a NATO member with only partial control of its territory, there's no telling how NATO could force Russia to cede the occupied areas. This has led NATO dividing itself into 2 camps. One of the camps is led by the US and Germany, the 2 largest economies of the alliance, which are adamant about maintaining the current involvement of NATO, only providing indirect assistance through donations to let the war reach its conclusion in time. The other camp seems to be led by France and the UK, which have started to propose increasingly radical approaches to dealing with the problem, including the aforementioned possibility of deploying their troops inside Ukraine. However, there's discord concerning this idea even inside those countries. The UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy has noted that the UK doesn't actually plan to send any troops away from its borders at this time. The latter part of the statement refers to the ongoing discussion on the members' possible elevated involvement in the conflict. The UK has so far been one of the largest donors to Ukraine, particularly of relatively modern long-range equipment such as the Storm Shadow missiles, as well as providing vital training for Ukrainian forces on handling Western military platforms and equipment. However, Lammy has stated that the country is adamant on maintaining its level of involvement in the conflict and not committing any of its soldiers to be deployed inside an active war zone. The somewhat contradictory statements from the UK and French authorities have put a dampener on possible military escalation on NATO's side. However, both governments have agreed that NATO has been ramping up its independent national defense efforts, particularly in Eastern Europe. This indicates that while NATO is not yet ready to commit to deploying its soldiers to Ukraine directly, the alliance has likely been creating plans for a possible conflict with Russia that would be fought entirely between Russia and NATO, independent of the current war in Ukraine. Again, this stems from the previous belief that NATO no longer sees Russia as trustworthy in obeying internationally recognized borders and agreements. The possibility of NATO's open conflict with Russia stems from a few countries having significant history with the Federation. In particular, these are the Baltic states Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which belonged to the Soviet Union and were relatively quick to join NATO after their independence. The other is Finland, which shares a lengthy border with Russia and was previously at war with the Soviet Union during World War II, at which point it lost more than a tenth of its territory. Furthermore, Finland and Russia have recently clashed over border issues, particularly with regards to Finland claiming that Russia is using the ongoing migrant crisis in Syria and the Middle East to overload Finland's justice and immigration system through the Russia-Finnish border. This has led to Finland closing most of the border crossings with Russia, and Russia reneging on agreements that were already tenuous between the two nations. But there's another threat to NATO beyond Russia: internal conflict. The alliance needs its members to agree on sweeping changes in policy to decide on providing Ukraine with more military assistance. The US, especially under the current administration of President Joe Biden, has been trying to maintain a more passive approach, prohibiting Ukraine from using donated long-range weaponry in Russian territory until November 2024, 33 months into the conflict. The Biden administration finally changed course when it started becoming apparent that Ukraine's domestic weapons industry already managed to create long-range warfare solutions via drones. This had the benefit of bypassing more of Russia's red lines, while also allowing Ukraine to mount more pressure via its long-range offensive. The fact that Russia's nuclear threats on NATO actually worked to delay several important shipments of military aid showcased that the alliance was still hesitant due to its belief in how far Russia was willing to go in the war, at least as recently as a few months ago. And more recently, there's another big reason for NATO to start having more internal debates: the US administration change. With President-elect Donald Trump winning the 2024 US elections, January 20th, 2025 is the scheduled inauguration date for the new president to assume office. At that point, the current Biden administration and its policies are likely going to be reviewed and adjusted to be more in line with Trump's geopolitical aspirations. And Trump has previously been vocal about NATO members not pulling their weight. In Trump's mind, most countries in Western Europe have shirked their responsibilities to the alliance, particularly in regard to maintaining a sizable active force and providing the recommended national defense budget of 2% of their nation's GDP. And while some countries have rectified this, at least partially, there's likely a long way to go before NATO countries fully implement their national defense overhauls that started in the early 2020s. For example, the UK military budget has been hovering around the 2% mark for 2 decades, with a sharp decline from roughly 3.5% at the end of the Cold War. This is further exacerbated by the country slowly losing portions of its armed forces, with the current 184,000 personnel representing a 14% decrease from the 2012 numbers and dropping below 80,000 active troops by the early 20s. Some analysts have gone as far to suggest that the current British Army is woefully unprepared to fight a prolonged, large-scale war similar to the one ongoing in Ukraine. The main proposal to rectify that would be to increase spending far above the minimum recommendation to at least 3% of the country's GDP. This would lead to the UK having a military budget of around $80 billion per year, which would be roughly 1/10 of the US budget, and allow the country to become the world's 4th largest spender overall, behind China and Russia. The budget could be used to improve both the number and combat preparedness of British forces, but also allow the country to modernize its nuclear deterrence systems. France has a different set of issues to contend with. The French government has basically retooled its military into a cooperative force that emphasizes international military operations and joint forces with other NATO members. This has allowed France to develop one of the highest potentials for quick response abroad and rapid tactical response both in Europe and other continents. However, the French military itself has similarly lost manpower in recent years, and the emphasis on international cooperation could mean that the country's focus on its own defenses may have been reduced over recent years. Therefore, it might not be surprising that the UK and France have similar objectives and aspirations inside NATO, mainly reinforcing the cumulative NATO defenses and borders with regard to Russia. After all, both countries have some of the most battle-tested militaries, with practically centuries of military experience in modernization guided by the US. Additionally, both countries have nuclear arsenals and independent nuclear deterrence policies, albeit their sizes and capabilities are dwarfed by Russia and the US. Which brings us back to the ongoing issue of the new Trump administration. Even if Trump acknowledges the progress the alliance has made during the 4 years after his first term, there's no telling whether he would continue to pursue an anti-NATO policy after Inauguration Day. If the US makes a 180-degree turn in NATO-oriented policies and starts looking into leaving the alliance altogether, it would mean NATO could lose the largest economy and military in the world, practically crippling its defensive capabilities. Of course, the European nations combined would still be able to win a potential war with Russia, so long as the latter doesn't resort to nuclear warfare. Perhaps more importantly, Trump's administration could lead to the US pushing for deepening its relations with Russia just like it did in his first term. This could embolden Putin to make more offensive moves both in Ukraine and elsewhere, and some of those will be out of NATO's purview and control. Both Ukraine and Russia are aware of the fact that the new US presidency could upend the entire tide of war, considering that the US has significant influence in NATO, which is in turn practically the only reason Ukraine has been able to wage war for as long as it has. Russia's increased tempo in Donbass and unveiling of more devastating ballistic weapons shows that it could be mounting a much more extensive offensive to kick off 2025, just in time to start making proposals for a peace treaty under Trump's guidance and oversight. And while analysts have previously suggested that the war was unlikely to finish during 2025, the changing geopolitical stance of the US could turn those estimates on their heads. It's up to the rest of NATO to make more determined and extensive moves to ensure that the US remains aligned with the alliance after the administration change. France and the UK are likely to remain big factors and influencers on those decisions. However, that still leaves us with a few concerns. Neither country is willing to make any immediate decisions regarding Ukraine, especially in terms of direct military involvement. If this continues, NATO could lose the advantage in the pro-defense narrative it's maintained over the past few years. But what do you think? Will the UK and France go against US leadership and try to move NATO deeper into conflict with Russia? Or will the US prevail in its wait-and-see approach? Leave your comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out 800,000 NATO and US military troops ready to enter Ukraine, or click this other video instead.